properties here are very, very old, and they've been run down. And the property and the current longtime building owners know that there is gentrification coming, so they're demanding top dollar. But then there's still these, to make them habitable, there's still a certain amount of money to put in. And this is kind of for the whole panel. This is not a new question. That's a conundrum. How do you get around that catch-22? You want to see the neighborhood improve. You don't want to see dilapidated buildings. You want someone to buy them who's going to fix them up. So tell me, what's the way out of that?
If I can sort of step to the side of that question for a little bit. Part of, I think, and you had when you gave us a list of questions, one of them was about this concept of what's a house versus what's a home. And I like that question because for me, it gets to what motivates me to do the work I'm doing in community development is I'm interested in creating homes, not houses. And to me, that difference is a house is a piece of real estate and it is an investment opportunity. A home is where I live and I build a life and I create community and I have security and support and things like that. And the academics, these are not new concepts. The academics have been playing with these concepts for a long time. Sociologists call this the commodity versus community decision. And it's how we approach real estate and how we approach the buildings that we have in our communities when we put them up. And I think fundamentally, something does have to change in how we think about these places that we build, the bricks and mortar that we put together, because our economy has put us in a position where the only way you can retire with something in your pocket is if you buy a home, make a bunch of money off of it, and sell it before you die, right? And that's the cycle that we have all gotten ourselves caught up in. As long as the home is a primary place for financial security, for long-term retirement support, things like that, it cannot simultaneously be a community space.
Can I add to that? Because I think that's profound. Yeah.
That's a huge statement.
Yeah.
Can you just say that again?
I think as long as we look at our homes as investment opportunities, we are not going to see them as places to build community and build lives.
But we think that we can.
That's right.
We separate that in our minds.
We can.
And are really happy going, I can do this, and then I really want to support from affordable housing, and you're saying we cannot do that.
We cannot do that.
Commodity versus community. Okay, so
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Because I think this gets to the crux of the issue. So the first thing I want to reframe is gentrification is not weather. So I want to make sure, I feel like sometimes we look at it and it's a gale storm and we think we have no control. And we think we have no agency. So first, gentrification is not an act of God and it's not weather. Gentrification is a system. It has structural imperatives. We are individuals that certainly participate and are complicit in it, but it is a structural issue that requires structural interventions to really resolve. So no, there is no silver bullet and there is not going to be any individual solution. You cannot, as individuals, solve the problem of gentrification, neither can I. I think fundamentally the space that we're in right now with this portion of the conversation, I think is really the crux of the conversation, is there's a difference between, and we do it in American culture all the time, we like to divorce our financial transactions from our values. And we like to suggest that we can invest in ways that may not be consistent with the kind of life we want to live and still be not a hypocrite. I mean, I'll just be frank. And I think part of what we are asking of ourselves all the time is how do I align the life that I want to live with the life I feel I should be living. Should is always a value statement, right? It's about expressing our values. We're doing that communally as well. And we live in a capitalist system where markets drive behavior all the time. But the check on markets is community. It's community expressed in policy, it's community expressed in program. And so we can certainly make the argument that there is demand for market rate housing in our communities, and therefore the real estate industries should simply step up to meet that demand. But we have proven over and over again that our communal values are important enough for us to intervene in the market in ways that create opportunity for people, and that's structural. And fundamentally, the argument over balanced development and affordability is to what end are we, communally and individually, willing to intervene in the market to express our values? And fundamentally, that is the question we have not answered, is what are we willing or unwilling to do to truly live the diversity, racially, economically, that we say we should have? Well, if we should have it, then what is stopping us from having it? And frankly, it's deference to the market. We should not be deferring to the market. Logan Square and Avondale should be communities if we value, if we should have diversity, then our responsibility is to intervene in the market in significant ways that are structural to correct for the market's inequity, because the market is inequitable.
I don't know. I own a building, I don't get top dollar for my rents. I know just from my own little thing is that if I tried to squeeze every last dime out of rent in my building, my places would stay vacant. So, I try to keep them in the lower middle area of rent, and I look for people who have stable jobs and who can rent them, because I don't see that it's my job to subsidize some higher ideal, because I can't afford it. So what are you saying? What would someone in my position?
I'm saying it's not an individual solution. So what I'm saying is that what we need to do are expand programs and funding. So for instance, Chicago Community Loan Fund is a Chicago Community Development Financial Institution. It's a different kind of financing model that puts community development as the priority and then leverages a variety of financial resources around communities expressing their collective values through collective projects, right? So I'm saying it's not your responsibility, Lynn Basa, to solve gentrification.
Oh, thank God.
Right. I'm also not saying that it's any individuals. What I'm saying is what does solidarity look like? What does an alliance on affordability look like? For me, I would point out we're an all-white panel, so I feel like solidarity really is like the concept we should all be thinking about, because this is predominantly an issue that affects the poor and affects people of color, and none of us are, I don't know about your economic circumstances, but we're not people of color, I can say that. So solidarity, I think, is the question. What are the systems, what are the structures, what are the policies? And to Mark's point, expansion of funding for cooperative loans, right? Like that's potentially a solution. The solutions don't lie with us as individuals. They lie with what we are individually willing to advocate for.
So,
I want to respond to your issue too. And it's not like you should feel guilty for buying property and renting it out and keeping it up and being a good landlord. That's a perfectly good and normal thing to do.
Correct.
I would say, as an economic vehicle, people who are buying property and then going and living in that themselves, and with the expectation that they are going to get a lot of equity built up over the next few years, I think is an unfounded, it's an unstable assumption, and that's what we're experiencing. So there's nothing wrong with being someone who develops rental property. That's a great thing to do, and there's also nothing wrong with somebody who develops property and sells it to people. But I'm saying the reason we have dramatic fluctuations in the housing market, and the reason we have situations where some people have access to a home and some people don't, is because we treat housing as a commodity. We treat it as an investment vehicle. We treat it as something that we should gamble with. But that's where we've stuck our society. Now, for myself, I've actually, a few years back, I sort of looked at the other side of the coin again for a while and said, you know what, we can make housing for free and we still can't get it out there for people if people don't have meaningful, wealth-creating jobs. And so we can't just look at housing in a bubble. But to John's point, part of this is creating, meaningful, well-paying jobs for people in that surrounding community and giving them enough money to, yes, buy their own home and have a place they can retire.
one of the things I want to point out is that this festival that's going on all around us outside, we were very concerned about making it very inclusive and multilingual, and we succeeded in that. When you go outside, we didn't want it to just be targeted to one demographic or anything, and you'll see that I think we're building that type of community here by this kind of festival. So I would say there are other ways of doing it, but I want to talk to you more about. I want you to talk more about this cooperative equity stuff. But Amie, did you have something you wanted to say after this?
No.
Okay. How about you?
Well,
Mitch?
I would just say that I think it's an unrealistic expectation to think that investors, people that are coming to buy property or more property in the area, that they're going to find they're going to find the ability to improve buildings that need improving and be able to offer them at below market rents. And I think really the only entity that can really do that is if the city wanted to come in and buy buildings and keep them rent controlled to offer people a place to go at the rent levels. They can keep them stable. They control it. I don't know that it's feasible for them to do that, but it's not realistic to think that a property owner is going to sell their building for less money to somebody else because they want to keep their rents lower than someone that's going to pay them a lot more money. money, so.
But
I mean,
isn't Bridgeshire Building a good example of that, where there was a combination of a private owner with subsidies, so that those apartments are lower than market? There's,
Well, there was TIF. There were
three-quarters
lots
of them are lower than market.
There were public programs that subsidized that
So
building.
but it's a public-private partnership.
So, yeah, that's what Mitch was saying. So, but I don't think the city, like that little old restaurant in 2943, that little Polish restaurant, I don't think the city has any.
The city's broke.
Yeah, and the city's broke. So, are there any other solutions or?
I have a solution. I take my solution.
Oh, yes, Jay?
The answer lies right here. The income has gone up 2%. Inflation has gone up 20%. This is all a symptom. The problem is minimum wage needs to get pushed up to $10.50, and a lot of this would go away because all the salaries would go up. And the reason why this percentage went from 35 to 47 is because rents keep going up, but the income's only went up 2%. That is the crux of the problem, and that is something the government should be fixing. And if they put it through, a lot of this would go away.
But part of this is also what kinds of loans and lending products are out there.
Yep.
Lending is very tight for mom and pop owners who want a loan to fix up their existing building and keep it strong. And we're seeing a lot of lending and investing going into outside investors. So we're going to see a lot of our housing stock is 2 to 4 flats. Traditionally, those had owner occupiers, and that was this huge engine that, in many ways, created a climate where these neighborhoods became attractive for investment. Now we're seeing more absentee ownership of those buildings. So we've really got to either address the banks and make sure that loan products are being created for mom and pop owners, or we've got to use credit unions or pull together cooperative funding. We've got to really look at what kinds of lending and investing is happening and refocus and retarget that to a model that incorporates more stability.
I really have two simultaneous questions for Mark and Mitch, but I'll start with Mitch first. Is there anything that you've seen out there? Because I know that your company doesn't buy and flip buildings. You buy old buildings and you hold on to them in the neighborhood. So in some sense, we're not having like the archetypal developer that we think of out here because you're into community historic preservation and stuff like that. But out there in like developer finance land, have you come across anything that you said, yeah, I'll do, you've convinced me I'm going to have below market rate rentals or, whatever. Have you seen any solutions out there for you is there anything to help you?
I mean, it's tough to go to buy a building, you look at what you're going to buy it for, how much you're going to invest into the building to create what you want to create, and it really comes down to making sure that you can generate enough rent from the tenants, be it national or local, to be able to afford that. And lenders nowadays, every lender has been burned, crashed years ago, and they're looking at underlying real estate, they're looking at the borrower, they're looking at the overall deal, because nobody wants to be in a position 3-4 years down the road where you're into a building for $2 million and all of a sudden it's worth $1 million and everybody's burned. So it's tough. I mean, you have to be very careful on what you buy, and frankly, a lot of the buildings, the low-hanging fruit per se in the areas are rundown buildings that need a lot of upkeep and a lot of investment, and those are the buildings that someone like me likes to go after because they're usually blights in the community and they're usually not really generating anything, of major importance. And to get in there and to revitalize it and try to stabilize it and hold on to it.
Yeah, and frankly, I don't want to see a pawn shop moving down the street from me. I'd like to see some cool little breakfast place. And I don't know, am I wrong? Am I bad for that? Is that?
Pawn
So
shops
you don't
are
like the
actually-
market either?
Pawn shops are actually an important resource for folks that are trying to cash.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, so,
Which goes back to the minimum wage thing. But I think, so part of the pro, and it's we run into this a lot with these conversations, is that, like, again, guilt doesn't help anybody. So this is not a conversation to elicit guilt, because guilt is useless to everyone. No guilt. I think there's only learning. No guilt, only learning. That's my model about all things. So what is there for us to learn? Well, I've lived in Logan Square my whole life, and I grew up in a neighborhood, and Lisette can back me up on this, that had terrible, terrible parks. We had terrible parks. We tried. We went to the parks, we played in them, we had terrible parks. And I remember feeling, I was like, 20 years old, coming home from college on a summer break, and seeing massive investments in Logan Square's parks, and feeling really upset, angry, that the only thing that I could think of that would make that investment reasonable now and not reasonable when I was 7 was that I was one of the only white people in the neighborhood, and it was mostly poor people of color. And that poor people of color don't deserve public investments. They deserve crappy parks. And when people of affluence, because this is not a white-brown issue, this is actually an economic issue, which just in this country is a white-brown-black issue. It's hard to know that the influx of money meant an influx of corresponding public money that meant that facilities and public investments got better. And I'm not saying this is unequivocally happening in every neighborhood, and I don't live in Avondale, so I'm not suggesting this is happening in Avondale, but gentrification is linked to an increase in economic investment. Whether that is private economic investment or public economic investment increases in gentrifying communities. And so I think part of what we have to be asking about, nobody's saying that we don't want the coffee shop. Yes, we want the coffee shop. We want the better Blue Line station. We want the better grocery store. We want the better. Everybody wants the better. But the question is, how do we make sure that the people who suffered through a lack of economic investment get to enjoy the benefits of it when that economic engine starts to churn again after years and years and years of divestment? And so that's the question that I actually think. It's not about whether or not we want the breakfast place.
And how do we know that the people who haven't lived here for years and years, who bought their house, like a lot of the people on the street where my building is, aren't thrilled with the idea that they've held on to this for 30 years and now they can move to Elk Grove Village or whatever and sell their house, make $75,000 on it, or whatever, or they paid their mortgage off. Who's to say that they're not thrilled either?
Well, they are, and we hear their stories all the time at CCL where they're coming in and they're saying, I don't want to have to move, but I don't have a choice. So I think that fundamentally it's having relationships with people in these circumstances, and many of you do, who, whether you're working on the Millshire or you're working on the mass evictions out of, I think it's a lot of rental tenants actually, and we are hearing their stories, and they are saying, this is my home, this is my home. I don't have housing. I need housing to maintain my home.
Right.
How do I stay here and again, going back to income, certainly income is a factor.
Okay, Mitch,
I have an interesting, question. I mean, I think, what's the difference between fixing up a community and gentrification? Because, I find myself as a developer, in situations many times where, for example, I'm in, an area of the city, I have a site that, Family Dollar is really excited about going in there. It's, the demographics are great for them, they think they'll do very well. But the alderman says, Family Dollar, can you do something like, can you build some new residential? Can you do something higher end? And you know what, I say, sure, but there needs to be a demand for that. And right now, I don't see it there. There's not enough pioneers to say, let's do that. Let's spend $3 million on a new residential project. So I think it's, when does catering to the existing community and looking forward at what you want it to be?
or build it, they
Yeah, I mean, when is fixing up become gentrification?
I think the crux of the issue there is choice and control.
That's right.
So yes, neighborhoods always evolve and change, and people come and people go. And even this neighborhood, some of the changes that it's gone through over the last 100 years have been changes of choice and control, I would say, where people they've made some money, they want to buy a bigger house, they want to move to the suburbs, they sell their house, they move on. That's great. That's an ideal situation. I would say what we have now is very, very little choice and control from the current residents. And there are some people that have owned their home 20 years, and they're like, yes, this is good, I'm going to retire, I'm going to sell my house, and that's great. But that's a small number of people, I would say, people that are being forced
enforce it.
And Emily, you had something you wanted to say?
Oh, yeah, I mean, it was specifically that park district thing, but when the community asks for something, if you're gonna say, talking about the parks being improved, I used to volunteer at the Chicago Park District, and there's a lot of communities that just don't ask for stuff. And part of the reason is, you know, when you ask for improvements, then people with more money want to move to your neighborhood too. So it's sort of this twofold thing. Is, you know, one, people don't know they can ask and get city improvements, but two, some people are scared of what that means when you get those improvements. And, you know, I've had people who are volunteers for gardeners and got yelled at by neighbors for gardening in the parkways because it's going to, you know, ruin their neighborhood in a way.
But I think that goes back to choice and control, though. I think that goes to Mark's point, that when you feel that out of control, I think that's actually just a symptom of the insecurity that a lot of families are feeling about their futures in the community. I mean, if I felt insecure in my home, and I thought gentrification was like, or you know, the wave was coming for me,
Threaten your home.
I would be like, don't do anything. Like I just want
Don't
the
call
status
attention.
quo, and I actually think that that's just a symptom of the broader question of choice and control that we're seeing.
Sure, I just have questions about this idea of rent increases as solely being due to economic necessity by the buyer. So I live right at Central Park in Milwaukee, right up the street from here in Avondale. We moved in about a year and a half ago. The building did not change hands. There were no material improvements in the building, but our rent is going up by $250 a month. So I have to question like whether that is due to economic necessity, and I haven't seen evidence of that, or whether it's just that the owner of the building believes that they can get more money for our rent. I think you saw the same thing, Amie, in the case with Mr. Fishman's building, where it had not changed hands. He already owned the building. There had been no material improvements in the building, but people complained about those material improvements, but the rent for all of those tenants was going up something between $400 and $500 a month. So I just have questions about the model that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's endemic in our culture where